Hello, this is Rick Brandenburg again for Turf Bugs and Rock and Roll in North Carolina State University. There is a question that I get asked over and over and over and over again. So since the answer doesn't appear to be clear, I think it's time that I went academic on you and treated this like it was a college class. So with that, that's what I'm going to do. Okay, now everyone listen up. This is serious business. The question I get asked over and over and over again is, when an insecticide does not work, is it due to insecticide resistance? And I get asked this question all the time about white grubs. And I want to explain this to you. So everybody watch, because there's going to be a quiz on this in the next video. Now what we've got here is a graph. On this axis, it's the number of generations per year that the insect has, such as 1/2 a generation. In other words, it takes two years for the insect to complete its development. 1 generation per year, which is typical for most of our white grubs and for mole crickets and many other creatures. And then 2, 4, and it could go on up 6, 8, 10, which would be things like armyworms and cutworms. Across the bottom axis, we have number of years to develop resistance, from 0, 10 to 20. If we drew a line for how many years resistance it takes based upon the number of generations, it would go something like this. In other words, the fewer generations per year, the longer it takes to develop resistance. The reason for this, when you have a lot of generations and you have to treat many times in a year with the insecticide, you have a lot of what we call selection pressure. In other words, you're selecting for resistant insects. When you have 1 generation per year, which is what happens with white grubs, you only treat once a year, 1 generation a year. So typically, the expected time to develop resistance would be 12 to 14 years. So when we think of that, and products change every 10 to 12 years in many cases, it's very rare for, in the case of white grubs or mole crickets, for an insect to develop resistance. It would be much more common in the case of, like we see in Florida with southern chinch bugs, where they're treated multiple times a year and they have many generations a year, for the resistance develop in just a few years. So I hope that concept is easy for you to grasp, that basically an insect that only has 1 generation a year, such as the white grub, usually gets exposed to an insecticide only 1 time a year. So it takes well over 10, 12, 14 years in most cases for resistance to even become a concern. So if you're treating white grubs and insecticide doesn't work, the likelihood that it's insecticide resistance is probably pretty limited. Remember, next video there will be a quiz. See you then.